All right, so look, let's start with a bit on spring grazing management. And here's a few photos, I guess, that I took up on Combine about 3 weeks ago, where conditions have certainly been excellent. This is on the southwestern end of Combine, and these all came off the same farm. And I guess, you know, it shows 3 different sort of group grazing residuals at the moment that we're sort of seeing around the place. And I guess what we're seeing is the cows are really starting to move into a mode where they're certainly wanting to eat, but the actual estimation of pasture on paddocks is very, very difficult. And if paddocks have got away a little bit with feed in particular, and I'll show you a little video on this shortly, it can be very difficult to actually manage the grazing to a point where we're actually getting our residuals right. There is this need at this time of year to balance the need for quantity, quality and regrowth and the needs of cows. And quite often they don't always work in total parallel. If we're looking to luxury feed cows and get as much production out of them as possible in the short term, we tend to over allocate pasture. I guess the flip side to that is it can leave some of our residuals a bit long, like we see over here on the right-hand side. Now that's okay if we're in a very defensive position with respect to drought or going into winter, but at this time of year, if we start leaving paddocks like we do, like this one on the right-hand side, that can have a pretty disastrous impact on feed quality as we progress further into spring. So again, look, I think thinking about these issues around pasture quality and pasture management really, really important now, because one of the other things which we think is going to be very important at this time of year is just making sure we are on top of things with respect to fertility. And I guess as we move into spring, the nitrogen requirements for our plants starts to increase quite dramatically. And we'll talk a little bit on that as well as to what requirements for nitrogen may exist in our system. And I guess some of that's going to be driven by people's targets as to whether or not they're actually trying to produce excess feed for conservation, or if they're just trying to maintain pastures for grazing. I guess it's often important at this time of year to take pastures down pretty hard, if you can, without punishing production too much. And that's just important to reset where that residual is growing from. So more of a paddock on the left. Now, if we look at that paddock over there on the left, that looks really, really well utilised, but it's perhaps been grazed a little bit hard with respect to production, but it's probably ideal with respect to setting the pastures up for growth coming into the spring. That really resets our growth point at a nice low part of the plant, that point of the plant. We're taking away most of the stem. Cattle are just starting to eat into the fertility patches, so they're just a bit hungry, okay? And again, quite often, particularly if people have been using a bit of gibberellic acid through the winter, we can see that in the annual grasses in particular, that the crown of the plant can start to lift up. And if we don't take that down with a good hard grazing or a mow at this time of year, again, that'll impact our pasture quality as we go into spring. So look, I guess at the moment, we're generally starting to pull our rotations right back on our annuals and Italians. We're looking at probably chasing in well-fertilised pastures a 2-leaf type grass rather than a 3-leaf type grass. And that'll give us pretty good nitrogen and water use efficiency, but that's going to have our rotations getting much closer to 20 days. So, yeah, look, Josh, look, have you got any comments, mate, that you'd like to add to this, or Kyle, or any other people in the group?
Yeah, Josh here. Neil, you covered it pretty well. The only thing I'd sort of say is separating that pre-grazing as to the residual, and you know, to set your rotation length, it's all about your pre-grazing. So understand that it's 2 to 3 leaf, right? Now, as Neil said, you mainly hit 2 leaf this time of year if you've got good nutrition, but 2 to 3 leaf or canopy closure. So one thing we didn't capture on, and it's definitely going to happen in the next 3 to 4 weeks on well fertilised paddocks, is if you're going past that canopy closure. So if you look on that photo on the right, and there's some grass in there that is definitely been past canopy closure.
Here we go. We can have a look at the video here as we go.
Yeah, so that's getting past canopy closure. So what that's going to do to your stand is stop the light getting down into those new tillers. So you've got new tillers coming out of the ground every time you grow a leaf. And those new tillers, if they don't see sunlight, they'll, one, abort, or what will happen in spring is that plant will elongate, as Neil was saying, and then that plant elongating will then try and shoot a tiller out of the side of the plant at about 2 inches off the top of the ground, and try and find some soil, which it won't be able to. So as soon as you come back to set that residual, you're going to lose all those new plants that you're producing. So making sure you don't go past that that canopy closure is just as important. And the other one is, especially on these kikuyu systems, we need to make sure we're still allowing that light whilst the kikuyu doesn't want to grow at the moment because the night temperatures are still a bit cold. It still needs to live. So it still needs to photosynthesize, it still needs to see the sun. And if we're getting pastures like these ones on the left here now, we're stopping that kikuyu from being able to see light. And I've seen so many times in poorly managed ryegrasses in spring where they're this term of locking a paddock up for silage, which needs to be thrown out the window. You should be cutting silage when you're meant to be grazing it. And they're locking paddocks up, allowing it to fall over. And one, you lose quality, but two, you're actually stopping that kikuyu from seeing the sun. And then it doesn't be able to build any energy up. So when it gets to that December period onwards, it needs to be able to store some of that energy so it can recover and go. So, going past that canopy closure is really important. And there's really a lot of paddocks out there now that if they're fertilised well, are going to start to get to that point. So, and there's ways of minimising that. And then, as Neil said, the alternative to that, that's setting your rotation length is by that 2 to 3 leaf or canopy closure. But our residual needs to be that 4 to 6 centimetres. So 4 to 6 centimetres is the ideal because you want to leave that stem for the regrowth. That's about in a nutshell. Real quickly, Neil.
No, that's great. I'll just flick this other video on while we're here. Okay, so this is that paddock after it was grazed, and you can just start to see once it gets a bit long, not only you've got the issues of the canopy closure occurring, but it's very, very hard to get the cows to actually eat this down to where it probably needs to be. And the challenge we've got now is that this pasture is only going to regrow from where it was left last time. And again, you can see that's just getting a bit ropey and a bit leggy. And I guess, what are our options at this stage if the pastures are getting away? And I guess a lot of it's about what Josh probably alluded to with respect to maybe taking paddocks out earlier than you would otherwise to start focusing on getting a bit of additional high quality silage if some of those paddocks are getting away. Because once we get into the growth rates at this time of year, if you try and chase this with cows and we get a bit more moisture and a bit more rain, you're going to lose. It is going to get away from you, depending on the fertility. So rather than managing it with cows and chasing an ever increasing residual, we're often better to say, okay, I'm just going to skip the next 5 paddocks in my rotation and take those out and consider cutting those for silage and get the cows back onto the stage of pastures where they can manage it effectively with grazing. So any thoughts or comments from the group on that?
Mistakes are going to happen, and this is definitely going to happen on most farms. And it's about recognising what's going on. So don't be too upset when it happens. But the fact is, good operators recognise it's happened, but they fix it today. So if it's wrong in the paddock today, it's going to be wrong in the paddock tomorrow. It's going to be wrong in the next day. So put some things in place. Okay. So like we said, it's not about your allocation as such. It's actually about your rotation lengths too long. If you're going past that canopy closure, so instantly you need to shorten it up. Okay. Now where you cut the silage, that doesn't matter. As long as you pull the hectares out of the paddocks, you'll start to fix it. But yeah, if it gets too far away, like Neil said, skip the paddocks, and if you can get a contract or do it yourself, get on top of it. But planning ahead and noticing this before it gets too bad is the important bit, because then you're not making a big decision. If you make lots of little decisions, you don't have to make a big one.
Absolutely. I think that's spot on, Josh. And I guess a lot of it's about confidence too, because people say, oh, I'm worried about running out of feed. And I guess I always think about confidence as points of a compass, where if we look at how the planets are aligning, if we've got good fertility, if our plants have got good strength, if we've got a reasonable amount of moisture, if the forecast looks good, okay, we can be much more confident about pulling paddocks out and not trying to just be worried about running out of feed. When we really get into silage season, I encourage a lot of my clients to say, well, look, if you can't eat it in the next 2 weeks, we can probably afford to cut it, and particularly if all those points on the confidence chart are in the right direction. If you've got the good moisture, you've got rising spring temperatures, you've got good plants, good fertility, it's going to grow back. And the worst thing you're going to be is 2 or 3 days short of feed at the other end. Okay, so having that confidence to go in and take a fair bit of country out at the right times is really, really important. And again, what with this is where if you just use leaf stage, those paddocks that we looked at that had canopy closure, that was sort of 3-leaf ryegrass. And again, leaf stage is probably not the right way to manage that. Okay, we need to actually just think in that situation about coming back to cover and canopy closure. Happy with that, Josh?
Yeah, mate. No, that's exactly right. So I guess, you know, leaf stage, it's the science isn't absolutely fantastic. So it's 2 to 3 leaf. When we get to 2 leaf, we know we've stored the energy in the stem and the roots, so that plant to recover. So as long as you get into 2 leaf, happy days. Once you go past 3 leaf, you're losing quality. Stay in between the both of them, but don't go past canopy closures. So it's whatever comes first.
Excellent. So any questions from the group?
Neil, I've got one here. If it's wrong, is pasture topping helpful?
Absolutely. Yep. And you get to a point where if you've missed it, you've got that stem, if it's getting up probably about 5 to 7 centimetres high, okay, and the cattle are leaving it and we aren't able to harvest it another way, knocking the topper over it is going to be quite beneficial to those pastures, particularly if you've got shorter term annuals, because all that'll happen if you don't do it is it'll just keep coming out the top of that plant. It'll get increasingly ropey. You won't stimulate any additional tillering at the base of the plant, and will continue to drop pasture quality through the season. So silage, hard grazing with following stock is another option. So we've used that on a number of farms. If you've got hungry dry cows, okay, it can be a good way to manage that excess residual as an alternate. That depends on your ability to manage it with fencing, topping, and the other option is pre-mowing in front of the cows.
Neil, just one thing. So with the clumps and stuff that we have in the paddock, one thing I sort of work with guys as a rule of thumb, once you're starting getting 30% of the paddock with left clumps and left urine stains and all that sort of stuff that they're not eating, topping is a good option to try and, so if you put all those clumps in a corner, it's about 30% of the paddock. It's probably worthwhile running over with the topper or mulcher or some of the livestock to reset the residual, because what they didn't eat this time, they're not going to eat next time, and unless they're very, very hungry animals. So from a production point of view, you don't want them eating that sort of stuff.
And I'd second that, Josh, particularly in situations where you've got reasonable profile of moisture or irrigation to back you up, and you know your plant's still active growth phase and we're in spring. So yeah, no, I think that's terrific advice.